Each of you has been involved in setting a proposed budget at the local, annual, or general church level, and what considerations go into that, and how do fluctuations in giving ultimately affect what the church is able to do. Reggie, would you like to?
Thank you, Vicki. I certainly would. Since we just went through this process at my church last night in regard to getting the budget approved at the finance committee level, certainly as we set the budgets every year, we go through an analysis of what we've actually done the previous year, particularly what our giving has been the previous year, then what our needs of ministry and mission are, and certainly operationally. But I think everything's really key for what do we want to do ministry, and then how are we going to be able to support that from the standpoint of our gifts and giving. And then from that perspective, as we set the budget, we typically look, this is the portion that we're going to have for our mission, of which we do include the apportionment of connectional giving as part of our missional budget. Okay. That's because we feel that's what it is. And then we set the other areas of our budget up, and then we're at that point getting it approved by our ministry council, and we move forward. So that's kind of locally how we approach it.
And I agree with that. I think one of the challenges we see, or I've seen at the local church level, is a budget is just a plan. It's a plan for the year, and you have to fund that every Sunday and every week. You have to keep funding it. And in our church, I think probably with a lot of churches, we receive a disproportionately large amount of our income in December. So we're on a calendar year. So the problem we have is a cash flow issue throughout the year, and you can't not pay salaries, you can't not pay the electric bill, and unfortunately one of the things that you seem to be able to defer is apportionments, your payment to the conference, and I think that happens a lot. And so we end up, and I see other churches doing this, paying a large percentage of their share of conference apportionments in the end of the year, in the November-December time frame. But I see that happening a lot. But I think you have to, if I can use the term, sell your budget every single month, and you have to help people understand how giving to that budget helps with ministry and makes ministry occur. Otherwise, you're going to end up at the end of the year in a really bad spot, and you can't recover from it.
I believe that when you see a budget of a church or at any level in the denomination, you're supposed to see what is your mission. You know, when you see the numbers, then that's telling you where is the priority of the mission. So budget is stewardship, but then in reality it's connected to our mission. What are we supposed to do? What are we called to do as a church? And that is not only at the local church level, but for example, when we were working with the allocation at the connectional table, with all the funds around the denomination and how to allocate them and do a good job in being good stewards. The first thing that we say, okay, let's set up some core values to understand how we're going to do this. And the core values include the mission. What is the mission of the United Methodist Church? What is the mission of the agencies, and what are our priorities in our mission? All the priorities, all the emerging priorities as well. All of that is connected to what is our mission. And then stewardship. Stewardship from the perspective of, okay, we need to make sure that it's transparent. Equity and justice, you know, to make sure that those resources that, or those agencies, for example, that have less opportunities or less resources, well, let's don't touch them, because they will not exist if they don't have all the support. And equity in terms of, okay, which agencies and which programs will be in jeopardized if they don't receive the funds. And then at the end, our work was basically to make sure that we kept those two in mind, you know, the mission and being good stewards and equity in the process. The same thing happened at all levels. If we keep that together, it's extremely important for us to survive like that as a church.
And at the general church level, I'll offer that input from the connectional table was one important part of what went into setting that budget that is being proposed for the next quadrennium. And it was one part. So we had several different teams working through that process, where we had a connectional table bringing in ministry needs and funding requests. We also had the Economic Advisory Committee that looks at the prevailing economic conditions all over. They are intended to be our more objective group that looks at what's going on in other places in the economy and in attendance, or some of the factors, some of the bigger factors that happen. So they give input. And the input that they give is basically kind of almost a top dollar that the general agencies and GCFA then should consider in what's recommended to the General Conference to be voted on. So the Economic Advisory Committee gives input, Connectional Table gives input, there's a budget advisory team that's made up of individuals from the Connectional Table as well as GCFA that also give input. They set core principles, values, just like the Connectional Table did, and the things they're going to look at as they're looking for that budget. And then finally a budget goes then to GCFA that also works at a joint meeting with the Connectional Table for some final budget that then is recommended to go to General Conference for consideration. For this quadrennium, the overall budget that's being proposed is a $105 million reduction that came from input from all across the board on what local churches may be able to fund, the way we're in ministry together, and trying to put that priority together. So we did see that reduction that's coming in what's being proposed to General Conference. And then we all know that when it goes to General Conference, there will be some motions that may come that could add to that, could reduce that. There are changes that could happen at General Conference. And then that's what ultimately is used to create the apportionments that are then allocated to the annual conferences and from there down to the local church. So that starts from the general agency budget, from that General Conference apportionment, starts with all of these groups and all the feedback that they receive, and then goes to General Conference for vote. And then the delegations who are there, they're the ones that vote on that. So they're the ones that set that budget for the next quadrennium, and then the apportionments and that allocation comes through GCFA that goes out to the annual conferences.
Okay. So John, could you speak to how money goes from the offering plate to the connection?
Well, sure. I think Christina's done a good job of that already with her last response. But I would say that I think it's important for us to realize that money that is spent in the church, whether it's globally or the global church or at the conference level, all that money comes from a contribution by some individual at the local church level. We call it the offering plate, which is kind of a 1950s way of thinking about it. But some people do put money into the offering plate. But there's lots of ways to give, whether it's electronic or lots of other ways than just putting in the offering plate. But I think it's important that you have as broad a group as possible having input into how that money is used. And so the local church gets together and has broad input into how their budget goes, which includes what goes to the conference. And the conference has the same through their CFA and the annual conference meetings. And I think Christine kind of alluded to all that. So the part I guess I would add is let's never lose sight of the fact that all that money comes from somebody making a decision to make a donation at a local church level. That's where all of it comes from.